Welcome. Today, we're going to demystify a really powerful statistical tool called survival analysis. And I know, the name sounds a little intense, but it's actually this fascinating way to understand time itself and how we can predict outcomes and manage risk, not just in medicine, but pretty much anywhere you can imagine. So let's start with a really fundamental question. When a patient has a serious illness, how do doctors get beyond just a simple prognosis? How do they really dig in and understand the risks over days, weeks, or even years? How do they predict that timeline? Well, to answer that, we're not going to stay in the world of theory. We're actually going to dive into some real, anonymized data from a study of 262 stroke patients. By following their journey, we can see exactly how this whole survival analysis thing works and get a feel for why it's so incredibly important in the real world. So here's our game plan. We'll start with what survival analysis even is. Then we'll tell a visual story with the data. After that, we'll start comparing different patient outcomes, figure out how to isolate the key risk factors, and then zoom out to see why all of this really, really matters. Okay, so let's get right into it. What exactly is survival analysis at its core? At its heart, survival analysis is all about answering one key question: how long until something happens? And that something could be death, sure, but it could just as easily be a part on a machine failing or a customer canceling their subscription. And that's the absolute key here. It isn't just about if an event will happen, but when. To really understand that when, we kind of need to see it. And that brings us to probably the most famous tool in the survival analysis toolbox, something called the Kaplan-Meier curve. It's just a really powerful way of telling a story with data. The best way to think about this is with a simple analogy. Just picture a survival staircase. At the very beginning, everybody is on the top step. That's 100% of your group. But every time an event happens, in our case, a patient passes away, the group takes a step down. So the graph you end up with tells this whole story of survival over time. All right, so now let's look at the actual numbers behind that staircase using our data. On day 1, you can see the survival probability is pretty high, 93.5%. But watch what happens. By day 12, we've taken a few big steps down that staircase. The probability has dropped all the way to 58.9%. And then by day 25, it's down to 41.3%. Each one of those drops, it's more than a number. It's a picture of the pace of these tragic events. Seeing the overall picture is powerful, for sure. But the real magic of survival analysis happens when you start making comparisons. Can we find patterns that might explain why some people have worse outcomes than others? So let's ask a really specific question. Does a pre-existing condition, something like diabetes, have a real impact on a stroke patient's survival? Well, with survival analysis, we can literally split our group in two and build a separate survival staircase for each one. And wow, the results are striking. You basically get two totally different survival staircases. Let's just look at that day 12 milestone again. For patients without diabetes, their staircase is way higher. Their survival probability was 73.7%. But for patients with diabetes, their staircase just plummets, down to only 40.3%. I mean, that is a staggering difference. It paints two completely different pictures of risk. Now, you'll often see this little number with results like this, a p-value. So what does this tiny number actually mean? Well, think of it like a confidence score. It's telling us that the odds of seeing a difference this huge just by pure random chance are less than 1 in 10,000. In other words, we can be super confident this isn't some fluke. It's a real, significant pattern in the data. So, the takeaway from this is pretty undeniable. The data from these patients shows that having diabetes was a major, major risk factor that seriously worsened their chances of survival after a stroke. But, the real world is almost never this simple. Patients aren't just diabetic or not diabetic, right? They have tons of other things going on. So that leads to a new problem. How do we figure out which factors truly matter the most when they're all tangled up together? I mean, a patient has an age, a certain blood pressure, and a level of consciousness when they come in, which doctors measure with something called the Glasgow Coma Scale. With all of these different things happening at once, how can we be sure it was the diabetes and not, say, their age that was really driving the risk? We have to find a way to isolate the signals from all that noise. This is where a more advanced technique called Cox regression comes into play. The easiest way to think of it is like a statistical control panel for risk. We feed the model all the potential factors at once: age, blood pressure, diabetes, everything. The model can then mathematically isolate each one. It can turn the dial on age while holding everything else steady, just to see exactly how much each factor independently influences survival. And here's what the model spat out. It found 4 key factors that really mattered. The Glasgow Coma Scale, or GCS, had a high impact. A higher score, meaning the patient was more conscious, was linked to much better survival. And look, there it is again, diabetes also had a high independent impact. Age and hypertension were also significant, but their impact was a little more moderate. This is how we go from a simple comparison to a much more sophisticated picture of risk. So, after going that deep into the data, let's pull back for the big picture. Why does all of this analysis ultimately matter? When you boil it all down, the power of survival analysis really comes down to a few key things. It adds that critical dimension of time, focusing on when, not just if. It turns a spreadsheet of numbers into a clear, visual story of risk. It helps us pinpoint vulnerable groups. And maybe most importantly, it lets us untangle that complex web of factors to find out what's truly driving the outcome. We've seen how this tool can predict patient survival. But the very same logic is used to predict when a machine part is going to break, when a customer is going to leave a service, or even when a startup is likely to succeed or fail. It kind of makes you wonder, what other critical timelines out there in our world, from economics to ecology, are just waiting to be understood with this incredibly powerful lens?